The NWSL season is going to kick off on March 25th. You can catch games on Paramount Plus, and we are doing a preview for every single club in the league, a podcast, and on YouTube. So make sure you tell your friends, your family, your cousins, your pets, your neighbors, everybody that you know that the NWSL is making its return. Lisa, we got to chat about Houston Dash. You ready?
I am so ready to talk about this team. I'm excited about this team. Let's go. Bring on the orange.
Dash on, baby. Let's start with an overview of Houston Dash and see what they did in the offseason. They're going to be led by new head coach Sam Laity. It's going to be his first year as a head coach after spending so much time as an assistant with the OL Reign franchise. There's also been some coaching shifts as well. Sarah Loden resigned with a coaching contract in place. So gonna have to see how the staff looks like moving forward with this team after Lawton did a lot of work with Houston. So we'll have to maybe keep an eye on how things get fleshed out there. This team finished number 4. They hosted a playoff game in Houston. They had scenes in Houston around this playoff game. I loved it. I remember when we were talking about the playoff push and we loved how they were marketing this playoff game. It was an exciting time. They made history as a franchise and they finally got to the postseason for the first time in their history, a 10-6-6 record to give them number 4 overall, but they lost unfortunately in that quarterfinal match to Kansas City, a 2-1 loss. And that meant, what were they going to do in the offseason? What was Houston Dash going to do to make sure that they not only try to make their return to the postseason, but go ahead and do better? So we took a look at some of their moves, draft, some of their acquisitions, and we gave them an offseason grade of a B plus. So let's talk a little bit as to why we gave them a B plus, because it includes everything. The offseason includes everything. It includes the coaching hires, it includes the new staff hires, it includes what they did in the draft and who they got, how they navigated free agency. And Houston Dash is one of those teams that made sure they locked up some players out of free agency pretty early on.
Yeah.
In the first ever free agency period. And they did it with re-signings. They wanted to make sure that they got back Sophie Schmidt. They wanted to make sure that they got back Elisa Chapman, 2 Canadian internationals who have been with Houston for a very long time and have really sort of become faces of the franchise in a sense, just because of their tenure with Houston. But they also went out and had an active draft day that maybe didn't necessarily include, a dozen draft picks, although they did make some good selections, but it included the acquisition of Diana Ordonez in a trade with North Carolina Courage. So we're looking at all of these different moves. And for us, I know the Ordonez acquisition is probably the bigger of the moves for this franchise.
Yeah, massive. I mean, I think with our grade of B plus in this offseason, I think it does start with someone like a Sam Laity, new head coach coming into this team who spent every other season, all 10 years prior with OL Reign as an assistant coach, saw a lot of different coaches there at OL Reign. I mean, mostly with Laura Harvey. And I'd argue Laura Harvey is one of the greatest coaches that we've seen in a very long time in the States. And to be able to learn from her over the last several years, especially the last couple being in OL Reign, this is massive for this Houston side. And I think, honestly, it was almost like a trade-off a little bit. Like, I'm sad that Houston lost Juan Carlos Amaros, because I think the turnaround that Amaros did with this Houston team last year at the end of the year was really good, right? He brought them to the playoffs. That first time the club had ever done that, and they lose him to a Gotham team and a Gotham side. This is the next best thing. And Sam Laity, it may even be better, because now you're getting someone that's coming in with a bit of a clean slate, had watched this team in Houston from a distance for a number of years, and understood in Sam Laity, as soon as he came in, he knew he wanted to re-sign some of these veterans and some of these staple pieces of his team, which says that he's been watching, and he didn't want a clean slate, right? Like signing a Sophie Schmidt, signing an Alicia Chapman, signing a Katie Lind, who's formerly Naughton, excuse me, got married in the offseason. I think those are massive. And Ali Prysock really shoring up your defensive end of the field is really big for this offseason of this Houston Dash team as they try to bring in some of these other players. Diana Ordonez, the biggest move that Houston could have made in getting the sophomore player forward, out of North Carolina. That was really the first move that we saw Sam Laity do in acquiring players. Just imagine a Diana Ordonez, an Ebony Salmon, a Maria Sanchez front line for Houston Dash, because that gives me chills, Sandra. That
I
gives
mean, I'm smiling listening to you chat about it. I think, you and I were at the
yeah,
draft, and when that trade went through, when it finally dropped, we were like, "Man, this is going to be fun. Houston is gonna stay a fun team because they were a fun team to watch last year. With Sanchez and Prince and Ebony Salmon who came into the mix in the second half of the season. So um, similar energy. We were just really, really excited to in terms of what this could mean for the
mhm,
Dash moving forward. And that was, in the middle of the draft. So they also made draft picks. They drafted Sophie Hurst out of Harvard at number 20, Jalissa Harris at 22, Lindsey Jennings out of Louisiana State University, and Madeline DeSino from UCLA. So walking away with 4 picks, both maybe all of them could be made an argument for defensive minded, but midfield and 3 defenders, I think, if you're looking for like actual positioning. But um, in terms of maybe the losses, for this team, like we're very excited for the additions, whether it was an Ordonez or even a Courtney Peterson that they engaged in with a later trade in the offseason with Orlando Pride, or making the signing of Barbara Oliveri from Liga MX Femenil, and this trend of like trying to make sure that they get local players kind of back in the mix.
mhm.
Olivieri is someone from Kent, I believe. Ordonez is really excited to be back home. I mean, that was part of the push for a trade to try to return to her hometown and home state and be able to play in front of family and friends. Making the acquisition for Havana Salon, getting some more
Massive,
midfield
yeah.
depth for this team because there might be some players missing during the World Cup. We've been talking about that in all of the previews, but it's not just going to be that World Cup stretch that they have to deal with. I mean, they're going to deal with having lost some players out of preseason and out of the offseason. They've already waived Julia Ashley and their defensive line. They waived Brie Vasali, who is now playing overseas with Brighton and Hove. Lindsay Harris no longer with the team. Midfielder Tierney Wiltshire is no longer with the team. But the biggest, I think, for these losses, we're looking at the absence of Nichelle Prince. She's listed
Yeah.
on the roster, but is out with a season-ending injury. Had torn her ACL, unfortunately, while on duty with Canada towards the latter stages of 2022. So I think that's probably the biggest loss, right? And I
Yeah.
think they knew that going into their offseason. They knew
Yeah.
that going into the draft. So making a move for Diana Ordonez, I think, it's a little bit, you got like 2 different players across the top line, and an Ordonez who could play more centrally versus a Prince who typically had responsibilities out wide. But I think when you've got, a Salmon, a Sanchez to sort of look at and sort of build that top line,
Ordonez.
and then you have an Ordonez now to slot into the front 3, I think they might not miss a step in their attack. But Nichelle Prince is still a huge loss for this.
Yeah. I mean, I agree. I don't think they're gonna they still have players to be able to play in that front line, but you miss that extra piece with Nichelle Prince. I mean,
Yeah.
she is just so crucial, and she has been for this team in the front line. I mean, she's one of those players that you know what you're going to get from her day in and day out. So that's really what they're missing. Now, there are other players that can step up, and right, it always provides more opportunities for other players to get more times, but that's a really big loss in Nichelle Prince. Now, she'll still be around the team, most likely doing rehab with the Houston training stash and be there, but it's still pretty difficult to not have her as a weapon to go to for Sam Laity throughout this year. But I think when you look at the gains and the losses for this team specifically that they've done, I think B+ is the grade we gave them. That's pretty honest. Because of some of the losses, right? I mean, you look at goalkeeper Lindsay Harris as well, no longer on this roster. I think that's a change in the locker room for this team that they're going to have to see and have to deal with a little bit, not necessarily in terms of on the pitch. I mean, we saw Jane Campbell run away with this team last year, and over the last couple of years, she's been the mainstay in goal. So it does help to add some of those new pieces in. But I think Havana Salone is a nice add-on from North Carolina as well in this mix. They've got good pieces. They definitely added some depth as well in getting a defender in Courtney Peterson. I mean, I think Havana Salone is also going to add a little bit of depth in that midfield. And then all of the draft picks that Houston came out of the draft with. I'm excited about that. Jalissa Harris,
Yeah.
that's a big get out of South Carolina, a
Yeah.
defender that can also add depth. I think that's where you really have to look at, because now they've got a lot of defenders on this roster and a lot of defenders that have been there consistently. And I know we're going to talk about that, but I think when you lose so many different players or when you gain so many players in your attacking end, you sometimes just get so excited about that, but you don't realize that you're going to have X amount of players sitting on the bench on the defensive end, and who's going to rotate in for those forwards up top, because we usually don't see that much rotation on the defensive side of things.